Do you ever find yourself thinking about the real you, like the version of you that would be and exist in the world if you threw away all of the ways in which you felt like you were supposed to be and disregarded all of the ways in which you show up to meet people's expectations of you? I got to tell you, I do. I think about it often, and in the last couple of years, I feel like I've made some real progress toward uncovering the truest version of me. I mean, can you just imagine if we all could show up as our true selves? What would happen?
It's like, what would we look like? And what would we be free to share? And how silly would we be? And how deep could we be? And how depressing could we be with one another if we just had that space to be all of ourselves?
That's my guest today, Jill Bourbonais. Jill is an IFS-informed Enneagram coach who works with clients to, try to uncover and get in touch with their true selves. Now, you might be wondering, what is IFS? And isn't Enneagram that thing where we're categorized into numbers? Well, Jill explains all of it and how it helps us on our journey of getting in touch with our true selves, or as she says, our capital S self. Essentially, it's this process of recognizing, honoring, and gaining perspective on the many parts of us that exist all at once.
In IFS, I've really learned that, you can't give your depression too much attention. You can't give your anxiety too much attention. You can blend with those parts and become them fully, but as long as you're doing it from a place of the true self and allowing those parts to do whatever they need to feel fully seen and fully felt, and allowing them to release in whatever way they are, they're allowed to stay in the room. And that's the only way they heal, is if they can stay in the room.
I encourage you to stick around to the end of this episode because Jill and I have an honest discussion around Enneagram. I share some of my trepidation around things like Enneagram in that I feel like it puts me into a box. And Jill shared some really interesting perspective on it and how she uses it with her clients. And the way that she explained it, I found really helpful and a lot more relatable than I initially had. I actually recorded this episode with Jill as Eileen and I were driving north through British Columbia on our way to Alaska. And as it turns out, Jill and I have some shared experiences as it relates to travel.
My trip was interesting. I used to be married. And my partner or my ex-husband and I, we actually traveled on and off, and that was that was actually the end of our marriage. So it was a really interesting time for me, but it also meant that I was traveling at points, and then I was going back home at points, and then I was going back and traveling, and then we were moving all of our stuff from California back to Michigan, and so it turned into a really, really interesting pinnacle in my life and my growth and my suffering and all of it wrapped up in this little tiny scamp, where we felt it all and experienced it all. So yeah,
Wow.
There's a lot to it. Yeah.
As you look at that time in your life now, what do you sort of take from that whole experience? Just because what a time of, I don't know, movement and transition, be physically moving and to be in a relationship, moving into very different places. What's your relationship with that time in your life like as you look back?
Yeah, I love the way that you said that when it comes to the movement of it all, because something that since that time in my life has been the continued growth for myself is I want the inside to match the outsides. And for me, my insides were matching my outsides in the chaos of all of that. It really was a really beautiful way for my marriage to be externalized in the chaos of it all. For us, when we traveled, as you know, there is stuff that goes wrong every single day. And so if the relationship is in any way in a place where it's not like attached well, all of that will rise to the surface. And so what's so interesting is like in that time, I think subconsciously we were both looking for a way to find peace, and we're both big nature people. And so we're like, our nervous system will be soothed through the peace that we will experience. And I remember talking to my therapist when I was on my trip and being like, yeah, it's so funny. I don't feel the peace of the trees like I wanted to. And it was so interesting to understand that what was going on the inside was really taking over the ability for me to hear and feel the nervous system regulation around me even. And so for me, I mean, the story gets deeper and harder. I also got pregnant in that time when we were traveling. And we tried to get pregnant for 18 months. I also didn't mean to go this direction. Like, I didn't know that we were going to talk about this. I thought about talking on this podcast forever, Chad. And I'm like, it's so funny that we're just ending up in this place. And of course we are. But I didn't prepare in my mind for this conversation, which is so funny.
The show has a beautiful way of leading us to wherever the conversation somehow needs to go. And I find whenever I prepare in my mind, even if I do some preparation around like, I think I want to talk to Jill about this today, it rarely goes that way. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. And it's like, it's so funny because there's that part of me, right, that's been preparing and almost fantasizing about like, what is it going to be? What are we going to talk about? And that part, I have so much love for that part of me in this moment as she is getting to experience the ability of just like my true self leading the conversation and, you know, allowing the part of me to relax that had an agenda or a plan is just another thing in my life that I'm working on and growing towards. So sidebar over there.
I just want to pause for a second and say what a really beautiful awareness that you have in this moment. I think it's cool that you just kind of process that aloud with me and with us as far as like, wow, I'm really recognizing, you know, I was planning on coming into this with a very different agenda, if you will, and just seeing how that's feeling in the moment. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I mean, that part of me is, she's so old, you know, like I know her tactics and I know her ways of wanting to prepare me so that I am seen properly. And, you know, that comes from a deeper fear of not being seen or known. And, you know, she has done such beautiful work to help prepare me for people and to be perceived and what that means and what that looks like. But these moments are really, really good for her too, to trust the internal parts of me that get to come out when she steps back a little bit. But yeah, anyway, going back, we were trying to get pregnant for 18 months. And I finally got pregnant our first month traveling, which is just wild. And you kind of going back to what you asked me about, like, what have you learned from that time? Like, what do you think of that time? I mean, I could talk to you forever about the things that I've learned and that I think, but I think most of all, that time for me was a time where through my baby that was not born on this earth, she ended in a miscarriage. I had a really, really scary corneal ectopic pregnancy. It's like corneal ectopic pregnancies are like 2% of ectopic pregnancies, and they're a really, really dangerous type. So I was rushed to the hospital, and in that moment, you know, I really had done so much work up to that point to understand what it meant for my parts to be held and seen and cared for. And I had done so much work internally to hold that space for myself And then I was brought to a process of pain where I really needed to extend that love to not only allow it to come from me, but to also come from the places that I had put in place to have it externally. And in my own experience, when that wasn't met, there were other parts of me that came up that were creating this wrestling inside of me of, do I continue to care for the parts of me that deserve this care through this relationship that isn't really doing that externally for me? Or do I allow the parts of me that long for the love and healing of my marriage to win? And it's really hard when you have two really, really beautiful and good parts inside of you that are wrestling and pushing up against each other. And eventually, through a lot of therapy and a lot of growth and years and years and years prior to even this, I learned that if any part of me felt like they could not be their fullest, truest, biggest self, that I was going to go and save that part of myself over anything else. And so that's what I did. And I moved back to Michigan and I met Eileen and everyone at the space, and I healed for a while. But I traveled first, which was, and going back to the traveling, Chad, like it's such a beautiful and wild personification of like everything being true at once. I was in the most beautiful places in the world. We were having beautiful, beautiful moments together and moments of the deepest pain. And so for that to all exist at once, that's like something that is so important to me in my healing journey and what I do with my clients and my own work with them. And is that like, there is no end point to your growth. And just because there are painful or hard or shadowy parts inside of you or around you, that has nothing to do with your goodness. And so it all exists at once. And I actually know when people are healing and growing, when it all exists at once. And not when we try to live more in one or the other. The pain or the suffering or the healing, whatever that means.
Thank you for being willing to share this part of your story with me. I just want to take a moment to say that I'm grateful, and so thank you for being willing to just share your story. I think that's the most meaningful thing that we can do as humans sometimes, is to share our experience. That's kind of the foundation of the show. So I want to say thank you for that. There's so much for us to dive into. I want to start with you've talked about how you want your internal to match the external. Was that the right phrase?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Tell me about what that means and what that symbolizes, because that feels like maybe the kind of foundational thing behind a lot of these different things that you're talking about related to parts. And so internal matching external, what does that mean?
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, I think this is kind of wrapped up in my work too. I help people heal through allowing them to heal their own parts using something called IFS therapy, internal family systems therapy, and the Enneagram. And me, I am an Enneagram 4. And so what that's looked like in my own story, because Enneagram work goes back to our story in childhood. And a lot of that story for me was first seeing the depth inside of myself, seeing the sensitivity, seeing what I now refer to as like my magic, and holding it really, really deeply. I was like a very, very sensitive, playful, exploratory, fantasy-driven child. And for the story for a lot of us is like, then we look externally towards the world. And it's almost like, it's like we took off our set of like rainbow colored glasses as we look at the world, and everyone looking back at us is like missing the magic and the depth and the sensitivity. And so that starts the narrative of feeling unseen, alone, and a little defective as well. And so that's kind of the start of why I say that I'm like protected by little tiny fairies inside of myself. Like, I feel like I went internal. I found a life of love inside of myself at a really, really young age. And that doesn't mean that I have not struggled with like loving myself. I'll just like separate that part as well. But I really was safe internally. And through that, I think I started to separate what safety looked like for me internally and what I thought I could get externally, or maybe even what I deserved externally. And so in this process, I have, as I've gotten safer externally and in certain ways, I have noticed that a lot of my parts are really afraid to come out. I was just talking to someone that you know as well, Olivia McMullen, about this because I was so nervous about being on this podcast. And so funny, I've been on a lot of podcasts, and this one, because I know the meaning of the people that will listen, there's a part of me, and I'm talking a lot about parts, which is part of the IFS system that we can talk about too, but there's a part of me that sees the meaning and the magic of everyone around me and then gets smaller and smaller and smaller and goes internal. And she said to me, Jilly, I am so thankful that your process has been you trying to figure out where your magic is, because in that process, you helped me feel so magical. And, that is like the beautiful part of this meaning making. It's like, there's all these little parts inside of me that sit on the inside and look externally, and they see the meaning and the magic, maybe when other people can't. And through that process, I used to try to, as an Enneagram 4, try to make myself different than the world around me to find my meaning and my magic. When, now I've learned that actually allowing myself to identify with the world around me and the magic that is held in the room, the magic that is held in the people that I see, allows the parts of me to say, hey, if you see the magic in all these people and you are one with this world, then it is also in you. And actually identifying with folks now, identifying with the truth that we are all meaningful and our stories are important. All of them means that my story is important. And so I'm talking in circles. Chad, help.
Okay, let's take us back to parts. So if you are a listener of the show, this is not the first time that we've had someone talk about IFS, talk about parts. So if you're new to listening for the first time, Jill, introduce us to what IFS is and how these parts that you're referring to, how these parts kind of fit into the equation.
Yeah. So we are all born with hundreds of thousands of beautiful parts inside of us. And we are also born with a true self. And as we experience the world around us, we start to experience the pain that some of our parts start to endure through trying to survive and thrive. And in that, they kind of section off into what we call protectors. So we begin to have parts that protect us through managing us. We have parts that protect us through not allowing us to feel the deep emotions. We have parts of us that try to care for us through people pleasing or looking a certain way or appearing a certain way or meeting certain expectations that we were given in childhood. And all those parts of us start to take over and we call blend with the truth, with who we are as people. And when those parts blend, when they take over, we actually become the age of when those parts first were created inside of us. So we can be, one of my favorite people ever, Anne Lamott, she says, I am every age I have ever been and will ever be. And scientifically and psychologically, that's actually very true. We are every age that we have ever been. And our memories in our brain don't actually live in the past. They also have the ability to become fully present in our lives in a moment, in a heightened moment. And so IFS work is really finding those heightened moments in your life, whether that is through insecurities that you have, through hard decision-making stuff, through conflict, through any feelings that we have about ourselves, and going to those parts of ourselves and saying, hey, what are you feeling right now? And how can we allow the true self part of us to create compassion and curiosity around that part? So instead of becoming that part has a voice that can care for them and hear them and see them and speak for them and advocate for them in a way that allows that part to feel really seen. And, a lot of times, especially folks that are doing the healing work, like we are often doing it from what we call an IFS self-like manager part. So it kind of appears like the self, but it is the manager part of us. And we know that that's true when that compassion and that curiosity doesn't exist. And when we start to intellectualize our healing instead of living and breathing into our healing. And IFS really helps us kind of not bypass the manager, but kind of allow the manager to take a little bit of a seat so we can get to those little, what we call exile parts, the parts that are insecure or need some healing, and talk to them and give them space. Because, in IFS, I've really learned that you can't give your depression too much attention. You can't give your anxiety too much attention. You can blend with those parts and become them fully. But as long as you're doing it from a place of the true self and allowing those parts to do whatever they need to feel fully seen and fully felt, and allowing them to release in whatever way they are, they're allowed to stay in the room. And that's the only way they heal, is if they can stay in the room.
This idea of IFS in parts has been relatively new for me, that I've been introduced to through some of these conversations in these past few months. It's made a lot of sense to me. There's something about it that feels, I really like this idea of, okay, we have the true self, and then we have these parts of ourselves that we, kind of learn and pick up along our journey, along our path. And I don't know, there's something about it that feels comforting, in that I can have parts of myself, and those don't have to be a reflection of my true self. And many parts can exist all at one time. And it's interesting, if I'm hearing correctly, we're kind of building these parts or picking up some of these parts along our path, along our story, right? As things are happening to us that are traumatic or highly emotional, we're developing these certain parts of ourselves, and now we're carrying those parts with us.
Yeah.
Is the place where, I'm going to say we go wrong. It's not really the right phrasing, but is it that we don't show love and attention to these parts of ourselves? Do we often try to maybe ignore these parts or not revisit them? So we're carrying them, but we're not paying them any attention?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of us, and I notice in a lot of my work and in my own internal healing work that will always exist, is that, I think a lot of us are actually run more by our protecting parts, the parts that protect us, more than the exile parts of us. And what's interesting about that is, neither is the true self, but the exiles are where the feelings live, And the protectors are the ones that protect the feelings. And so when we live in the protectors, we become more and more numb to the truth that was innately given and received inside of us when we were young. And that is where all the goodness lives. That is where all the healing lives. I always say healing is not something that is external. It is not something that is outside of ourselves. It is something that we need to remember, because those parts actually hold those truths. And so when we kind of trace back where these protectors came from, the protectors are always kind of connected to an exile, to the part of us that maybe felt shame or embarrassment or like they weren't enough. You know, an exile always has a story of being enough, feeling strong enough, good enough. You know, all the Enneagram numbers have different stories. But yeah, when we can live in our protectors for a long time and get away from the truest parts of ourselves. And, you know, I love what you said when you said, it helps you create space. You didn't use those words, but what I heard from you is this program, this way of thinking and feeling helps you create space for all of your parts and to not over-identify with one or the other. And I would say also, when I know people are really healing their parts, they grow to have so much more compassion for the parts of themselves that aren't their true parts, aren't their true self part. I have like my innermost child part. I call her my like little fairy Jill part. There's a theme, fairies. Okay. Yes. And she really gets to work alongside my true self part the more I have unburdened her. And, she kind of gets, you know, when your internal family system is working together, your parts don't ever leave. They actually stay and hold hands and help the true self. They all enter the room and they know their original intent and they know that it's good, and they don't have to work to get the external things that they thought that they needed, because they start to really rely on this internal system inside of them.
I know what's probably happening right now. You just heard the ad music play. You're starting to tune out exactly what I'm saying, so you can skip this ad and get back to the conversation, and I'm going to encourage you not to. Because if you continue to skip this ad in order to get back to the conversation, then at some point there may not be a conversation for you to get back to. Okay, now that I have your attention, that might have been a little bit exaggerated. Likely, I'm not going to stop producing this show, but you can help me make this show a lot more viable, and so I can continue doing this into the future. Fun fact, I don't make any money from this show. In fact, I actually pay in order to create these episodes on a weekly basis. And while that may not exactly seem like your problem or your issue, if you like meaningful conversations like the ones that we have here, well, then it is your problem. I could use your help in the form of financial support specifically in order to keep this show going and continually invest back into creating it. Here's another fun fact. If everyone listening to this episode were to donate the single cost of a cup of coffee, I could probably do this as a full-time job. That is a dream and a vision I have for myself one day, and I want this to be like PBS or NPR, where it's funded by the viewers. I'm imagining a show where we, together, collectively, decide that these meaningful conversations are important to us, and we don't rely on outside help or advertisers in order to keep them coming on a weekly basis. So yes, this is a long-winded way of saying I'm asking you for money. If you're in a place where you feel comfortable doing so, I am asking you to make a small donation to support the show. You can do that by following the link that is in the show notes of this episode to a place called Buy Me a Coffee. Now, by buying me a coffee through this platform, you're not actually buying me a coffee. It's just kind of a mental construct to make this transaction of money a little bit more tangible. Thank you in advance for considering supporting me, supporting the show, and for supporting meaningful conversations like the one we're about to get back to right now. Is that sort of the journey that we're on as humans, or like as you're working with some of your clients, is the journey to get back to try to return to our true self and try to understand these different parts and figure out some of where they fit in the journey and show them attention with the goal of getting back to who that true self really is?
Yeah, I think so. And, what's interesting is in parts work, what happens, parts work is part meditation. And in those moments, like a client will come to me and they'll be struggling with something, going through something, experiencing something, ruminating about something. And so the first thing that we always do is identify the parts in the room. And so we find that part that is ruminating, feeling anxious about something. And then we trace it back. And I say, hey, what is the first time you think that this part has ever felt this feeling? And we kind of go to those original stories where this part started to feel the ways that it feels in this moment. And you are now exactly the age that you are today and 6 years old when you first felt that feeling. And as that part of us that we learn to care for sits in their feeling with this curious and compassionate, all accepting self around it, the part begins to relax. And like, I'll see it in my clients, I'll see their body language change. And I'll see the shift in the unburdening happening in real time for that part. But what's interesting and what I wanted to get to is then I always ask when that real healing happens, I ask, hey, what does your part want to do now? Now that it doesn't have to carry that burden, what does it want? And usually our parts answer something like they want freedom, they want to play, they want to dance, they want to run free, they want to be with friends, they want to experience pleasure. And this is such a beautiful process because I really think that that is what our healing is meant for, is coming back to play, coming back to pleasure, coming back to what lights us up and why and how. And so, when we avoid these parts of us that feel really deep things or scary things or shadowy things, when we avoid them, we also avoid our truest intent, which is our ultimate goodness. And I think that is what the journey is. At least that's what it's been for me.
How do we know when or what our true self is? How do we identify with like, okay, I'm uncovering or rediscovering what the true self is? How do we actually know when we're there, what our true self is?
Yeah. So I'm probably not going to remember right now in this moment, but there is like 8 C's that they say are the characteristics of the true self. I know like one is compassion, one is curiosity, one is communion. There's all of these ways, but I think what all of those words really kind of stand for is like, how much space do we have to love ourselves? How much space do we have to love? That's how we find the true self. And so the question I actually ask first, and a lot of my work with my clients, I'll spend years with manager parts of people before the true self can come forward. Because often in this world, some of us aren't even engaged with the voices or haven't had the opportunity to be engaged with a voice that sounds like a true self voice. So finding that voice and creating that voice and standing in that voice for ourselves is a process in itself. And I know when someone is starting to get to know that true self voice, when I ask, how do you feel about this part of you? Maybe like an exile part. And I say, how do you feel towards this part? And they can start to say, well, I feel really sad for it. Or I feel really empathetic towards it. Or I want to go and give that part a hug. Or I'm so sad that it was lonely. Or, I'm angry for it. It's like the part that holds space for the negative feelings. And so I think that's a really good test inside of ourselves. Like in my daily life, I am engaging with myself to try to remember my true self part. Often I will ask myself, where is she? And she's never very far away. But she needs the space and intention to bring her to the forefront often, because it's just not the voice of our normal lives. It's getting back to, I think, again, the voice that represents God or the universe or love or nature. It's tracing back to a source that is bigger than us and very, very beautiful. And for a lot of us, we're not only working through our own parts, we're also given parts through our generational lineage. And so that trek back to the true self sometimes can feel really far away because we've had a lot of years of stories. We all have. And those stories are beautiful. And those stories also, if we're real and true about them, have been super, super painful. And so for all of us to get back to the true self, I think we all need to, honestly, and this sounds like almost silly, but just get back to what love looks like and feels like.
As I think about this idea of my true nature and who I am at my core, I can't help but think about all of the ways in which I've sort of programmed or learned to show up differently in my life from what my true nature truly is. My friend and recurring guest on the show, Nate Langley, and I often talk about this idea of operating systems. It's sort of like the ways in which we learn to act and show up in the world based on certain experiences in our lives. As I was preparing for this episode, I was reading some of the things that Jill had written on her Instagram, and there was a post that stood out to me specifically about this idea of programming. And I was curious how she viewed this idea of operating systems or programming and how it affects us. Oh, and stick around because coming up, Jill and I have a really honest conversation about Enneagram, some of my thoughts about it, and how ultimately we can use it as another tool in the toolbox of understanding ourselves on a deeper level. You had reflected on, I think it was last year that you had turned 30, and you were talking about, in your 30s, you wanted to be led more by your true nature and less by this programming that you had. And I read that and I really resonated with that because I was like, wow, I have lived a lot of my life because of certain programming that when I do this, good things happen. When I do this, I receive external validation, I get external praise, and then it gets programmed. I think it's these parts that are like, oh, hey, if we do this, then this happens, and we think that this is important, and this helps, protect whatever, build the ego. And so this idea of getting back to like leading with true nature has been something for me of like, wow, there is a sense of knowing, there is a sense of trust inside, and getting back to, well, if I listen to that, where does that lead me, and where does that take me? And it's been a lot of beautiful places. Is that kind of how you're viewing, when you say getting back to leading with your nature and not programming, are you viewing it sort of in a similar way?
Yeah, totally. And I love that process for you. And thank you so much for being brave with the true nature inside of you, because that's what I think of when you say all those things. I'm scared. I had the part of me that had all the preparation, the prepper part inside of me for this conversation. And, she is already in one part of my brain thinking about how chaotic I was at the beginning of this conversation. And and then there's another part that's like, but look at the magic. Look at the magic of relating to you in this moment in this way. And I'm actually thinking of a space class that I just took by Olivia McMullen, which is the reason why I called her up. But she had us stand like this in the class. And she said, this is the most vulnerable position. This is a podcast. So now I realize I have to tell you what I'm doing. My hands are up straight above me. And my sides are completely shown and my heart is completely exposed. And I think that's what we're doing when we're choosing to allow something other than our programming to exist. Going back to my anxiety around even doing this podcast, and I think that that's a fun circle that we keep going in, but it's the part of me that was scared that you would see my messy part. And she is a part that I don't let out very often, and I'm trying to let out more. And so if I'm not being led by my programming, what parts are going to step in? And I think that's the part that is a little bit scary and is unknown, because if I let my messy part out, what words am I not going to remember? And what ways of speaking am I not going to utilize? And what part of my ADHD is going to come out and thrive? And also, I think my messy part is my goofy parts. They are the parts that were loud and big and hilarious and didn't care and, would moon her friends so she could get a laugh. Like she is messy. And, again, the more we trust our internal life, the more we create those bonds with those parts of ourselves, the more we will allow them to lead us. And they'll have the safety to lead us because our compassionate self will say, go on, girl, do that, do that, be that.
I felt like something almost just clicked for me as you were saying that. I was actually on a podcast, I guess it was maybe 2 weeks ago. A guest who I had on this show, Angelo Santiago, had me on his podcast. His podcast is similar to mine in that there's no set questions, there's no set topics that you're going to talk about. And reflecting on that, I found myself doing the same thing. I'm like, okay, I really feel comfortable talking about, X, Y, and Z topics. I feel like I really have my thoughts together around those topics. And so let's try to steer the conversation that way. And I just think back to all these moments in my life where I've been afraid to enter into situations where it might go off script. And because I'm not comfortable with what might happen if we go off script. I think of a lot of work in professional settings where it's like, okay, when I come into this meeting, I need to have all of my points laid out, because if we go off of what I'm comfortable with and what I feel like I have a grasp on, I think there was a fear of what parts of me are going to show up, what parts of me are going to enter the conversation, and not just being afraid of what that would mean. Oh my gosh, this might mean that I'm not the really responsible and put together version of me that I think people want and that I think is important and that I try to maybe protect myself as. So this idea of just being afraid of what parts might come out makes a lot of sense. And I think I've spent a lot of time engaging in ways that was built on a lot of fear of some of the more messy parts of me coming out.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I'm so excited for you, Chad, because in that truth is also this really beautiful journey that you get to go on of trusting the parts of you that are so good and so magic and maybe not as put together, and what they have to provide for you is just going to make you more. It's just going to be the fullness. You're not going to be less put together. You're going to be put together and all of these other parts that have beautiful stories to hold and share and original intents that are just going to bring you so much play and life and truth. And that process really begins with you getting to trust those parts inside of you. And to trust them, you have to know them. And so you're going to continue, as I know you probably have been, as someone who's known you for 48 minutes, that you are going to continue to grow to be more parts of yourself as you get to know yourself. And they'll get to lead too. And so I'm excited to meet Chad, maybe hopefully in 5 years, and all the parts that get to enter the room in that time too.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I'm
Thanks for
curious about,
sharing.
what is your relationship at this point in your life with your true self? You've shared some of your story. I'll share in these 49 minutes and 36 seconds that we've known each other. It seems to me like you have this sort of energy and lightness about you. You hold space for me. You listen. You're curious. It's refreshing to see. I've appreciated your genuine happiness for me on my journey, and I think that is something that I try to bring to people in the show, is just being genuinely curious and like, yeah, I'm really glad and happy and proud of you for going on this journey. I've received that from you. So anyway, you've shared a lot of the parts of your story and things that might feel heavy, things that might feel very difficult, and it seems like who I'm talking to today is someone who seems to have a relationship with those things and carries those things and is still getting in touch with their true self. So maybe I'm trying to answer the question for you, but it just makes me curious about how are you seeing the relationship to your true self?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. This is why this podcast is so special, Chad, is because, this is a question that I would long to answer for 100 hours. And so thank you so much for asking. And as I was thinking about my relationship with my true self, it's just like such a sacred question, because this relationship with this part of me, my true self, is so sacred. And, I don't even necessarily love the term true self as much as I just like the capital S self. And I'm always trying to not we have so many words now, and part of the reason why I think I was so fearful to do this podcast more than others is because it was about just my healing life. And I think in my relationship with my true self, I've realized that I actually speak less in words and more in the feelings in my bones in my relationship with my true self. Like, as soon as I start explaining my healing, I'm going back to manager parts of me, parts that want to be explainable so that I can be seen in a certain way or experienced in a certain way or known in a certain way. And, you said you used the word genuine, I think, and I'm so thankful that you see that in me, because I think that feeling of being in the room with someone in presence is the feeling of true self in the room. And I think I know when my true self is very full and very self-leading, when sacredness enters the room, no matter what I'm doing, and compassion for myself enters the room, no matter how I'm feeling. So when my feelings become sacred, no matter what they are, I know that I am in my true self. The true self is presence without judgment. And I think that's where the holy sacredness of our truth and, our truest plan for ourselves lives. And, I don't think we have a purpose. I think getting in touch with this part of us and then living however we long to live is the purpose. And that's what I've learned from this part of myself. And, she is hard to explain. She is, my breath and my touch and my laughter and my tears. But thank you for making space just by asking that question.
You're welcome. The idea of presence without judgment is a powerful statement. I've got to imagine you've talked a little bit on some of your social media about trying to explain the Enneagram work that you do and how it kind of relates to the impact that it has on clients and what happens in sessions. And is that the foundation of the work that you do, is presence without judgment, you yourself being present in the moment without judgment and allowing presence without judgment for the person sitting across from you, the person that is in session with you. Is that what you feel like you're bringing to your clients in your work?
Yeah. Oh, I hope so. I mean, I think more than anything, like it is true. My true self is also so important in my work because I know that I might be the first space where that's being held for someone else, because our inside voices can be really tough inside of a lot of us, me included. And so I know that I'm beginning to help people find their own true self voice by holding that voice, that presence without judgment in the room. And I always say curiosity is the opposite of judgment. Curiosity can't exist while judgment exists. And so exploring a feeling or an action or a thing that's happening in someone's life without judgment is a really freeing experience for people, for me in my own healing work, because it creates a sense of, non-duality, like not good or bad, right or wrong. It just is. And sacredness is in the it just is space. And, when we can allow the isness of our truth to just come to the surface through that curiosity and compassion, those parts also become free. And so that's what I think my work is like, what parts inside of you are longing to be seen and are longing to be free? And how can we create enough curiosity around those parts to give them the space to soar?
There's something about this beautiful visual of honoring and seeing and recognizing these parts of us and giving them the space to soar that I really resonate with. I'm picturing these often hidden and unrecognized elements of our being that are just set free and able to go express themselves in their most true and full nature. And I don't know, I guess I just really like that idea. That feels really good. In some ways, it feels like part of what I try to do with the show is provide people this space, this idea of curiosity without judgment that Jill's talking about. And I guess it feels important to do that because sometimes I feel like that can be rare to experience in the real world. And I wondered if Jill felt the same.
It's so sad to have so many parts that could be so full in conversation with others if they just had that space. It's like, what would we look like? And what would we be free to share? And how silly would we be? And how deep could we be? And how depressing could we be with one another if we just had that space to be all of ourselves? And yeah, I long for that. Totally. I want to be that, but I also long for it. And I think we are mirrors for each other. I think the more space we create in our own conversations, and let me just also say this starts with our own internal life. If there's judgment externally, it's because there's judgment internally. And that makes me sad for those folks as well. And for me when I have that judgment. But yeah, we can also heal through that curious space that we want to hold.
If you've been resonating with this idea of getting back to our true selves and uncovering and recognizing and honoring these different parts of us that are necessary in order to get to that place, and if you've loved this idea of using curiosity without judgment as much as I have, then maybe you also found yourself wondering, well, how does Enneagram fit into this? And that thing with the numbers, what does that mean? And how do we use that in the scope of getting back to our true selves? Maybe you've had some resistance to these frameworks like Enneagram. And if that's the case, my friend, well, you're not alone. I've had some maybe resistance to things like Enneagram because I'm like, well, I don't want to like categorize myself as something. I have this like fear that it's gonna I have to, like, this is going to tell me who I am or what I am. And now I'm like in this box and I can't. So I really resonated with, it gave me maybe a different perspective of like, maybe I can have parts of all of them can be part of my story. There may be some that I identify or resonate with more. That kind of gave me a different perspective to being more open to something like Enneagram. So I appreciate that.
I love that. And two things I'll say from that is, one is, and let's have a whole conversation off or on about the Enneagram. That would be awesome to get to explore more. But two things. One is our basis in the Enneagram is actually 5 numbers. So we have a lot of people go to this core number, but we have parts of ourselves that really, really relate to 5 different numbers. As I told you, we have hundreds of thousands of parts. We've got 5 parts of us, at least, probably many, many more, that relate to 5 numbers in the Enneagram closely. And then on top of that, there's so much more. But when you say you don't want the Enneagram to put you in a box, that's why I'm so fearful of the conversation around the Enneagram so much right now, because the Enneagram is just very intimate language, very intimate truths around parts we already have inside of us. So whether you know the Enneagram language or not, you are interacting with your Enneagram number. They are all your parts. And so the Enneagram, the goal of the Enneagram is actually not to identify yourself. It's to allow those parts to break out of those protectors that they have. And that's why IFS work and Enneagram work so well together, because I'm like, okay, here's a list of parts that you might relate to through your Enneagram. Let's talk about where those stories started and how you relate to those parts and how we can allow those parts to, be their best selves, their most original intent, and also be free to make choices apart from the stories and the programming that they were given. Does that make sense?
It does. I also really like this idea of, providing language. It's almost like sometimes the way that I'm thinking about it is like, could Enneagram be something that helps provide language, helps give some sort of framework or structure to be able to initiate these conversations, initiate this way of thinking, so that it's like an accessible entry point to start thinking about and reflecting on and having conversation using language around the things that we may be internally thinking and feeling and not being able to assign language to.
Perfectly said. Perfectly said. That is exactly what it's used for. At its highest good, that is exactly what the Enneagram is here for. And I actually, in my Enneagram work, I've been studying the Enneagram for over 10 years. And that's why I moved to IFS, is because a lot of times the Enneagram gives us all of these parts. And then we're like, cool, what the heck do we do with any of that? And, I found that there is the deeper work that comes after knowing ourselves, which is loving ourselves. And I don't care how we're all talking about all of our healing work, like that is the healing work, is loving ourselves and then loving the world around us. And so the deeper work, around the Enneagram is like, okay, now we have all this stuff. How do we love this stuff into a place where we can heal it?
There's never a good point to end these conversations, but that felt like maybe a good one. That idea of knowing ourselves and then moving to loving ourselves is something I'll be reflecting on after this conversation. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining me in this space. Thank you for just showing up as you. And again, I think it's just so neat to see you kind of work through and honor the different parts of yourself literally through this conversation. And thank you for being willing to share your story and just enter into this thing that I've created in the show. I find it very meaningful. So thank you for being willing to be here.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Chad. And thank you for your presence and for all the parts of you I get to see through little parts of your story, and, just the parts of you that are maybe fearful or sacrificial or hold space for others, and the parts that long for community. It's beautiful to see you in the army that has made you inside of you. And so I'm so thankful to know you now. And hopefully we can keep that friendship going.
Agreed. Jill, thanks again. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, John.
If you wanted to connect with Jill and learn more about her work, she has a website, jillthehuman.com, and goes by jillthehuman_ on Instagram. I'll have both of those linked down in the show notes of this episode. If you enjoyed what you heard today, I have 2 invitations for you. The first one would be to think of someone who might also enjoy this episode. Is there someone in your life who you could text this episode to or share it with through email or post on social media? Because maybe they could take something away from it like you did. And secondly, I invite you to join the conversation. Head over to our Instagram page @ALevelDeeper and feel free to leave a comment on the post for this episode with some of your thoughts or maybe your main takeaway or a question that you might have. Or if you're listening, feel free to send me an email directly, aleveldeeperpod@gmail.com, as I'd love to hear some of your thoughts or suggestions on the show. Otherwise, that's it for now. Back with more next week, and we'll see you then.